Hi, I'm Jasmine, and this is Not Another PD. It's for helping professionals who are tired of theoretical training that doesn't translate to the work you actually do. Here, we talk boundaries, leadership, systems, and how to protect your well-being while doing complex work every day. I'm so glad you're here. Episode 29. Welcome back, everyone, to Not Another PD. This is actually a solo episode, and it's something that I don't think we actually talk about enough as a collective profession, which is our lived experience. I'm still largely seeing it as something that is considered perhaps a weakness or a disadvantage, and we'll be going into the difference between a lived experience and a learned experience. But a lived experience is often considered something to manage or something that sits quietly in the background that we don't acknowledge. It's important before we delve a bit deeper into this topic that we make it really clear what it is that we're talking about here. So, a lived experience is where we actually have first-hand, direct life experience of navigating a difficult experience or a challenge in our lives. And some examples, and these are just a few examples that I commonly hear helping professionals identify as some of their lived experiences, but it could include like mental health difficulties, substance use or gambling harm concerns, being a victim survivor of family violence, perhaps adverse childhood experiences, so experiencing unique challenges during their childhood experience. And as we know in the kind of work that we do, that our earlier childhood and even earlier adult experiences can still definitely impact us today as well. So that's what a lived experience is. So lived experience is not something you can acquire from professional learning or a textbook. Lived experience is something that we often and quite commonly don't have a choice in. So if we think about an example of adverse childhood experiences, we don't have any control, even though I'm sure that we wish we did during many points in time. We have no control over the family situation that we were born into. So the lived experience is something that we tend to not have any sense of control over. A learned experience is essentially the complete opposite. So a learned experience is only something that can be acquired through some form of academic studies, for example. So it could be university, it could be TAFE, also during the placements that we do as part of our qualifications. It's also through any professional learning, so any training courses we do, through our supervision. Even we learn a lot from our colleagues, from our line managers. So all these are experiences that we do have more autonomy over. So we've all chosen for whatever reason to enter this amazing profession, helping and supporting other people, often really vulnerable client groups. So we've all chosen this profession. So the learned experience, we have a degree of autonomy over and a choice, which is very different to a lived experience, in which it's not something we intentionally acquired. It's not something we signed up for, like a degree or a professional learning. So it is very different. And so with the lived experience, it isn't always recognized as a strength. So it can be seen as, oh, that's too challenging, that's uncomfortable for me, it's better. And if you've ever heard people say, oh, let sleeping dogs lie, it's like, okay, if you've had this lived experience, then As long as it doesn't in any way impact the work you do, then that's fine, but we don't want to know about it. So that's sometimes the viewpoint that I hear from, organizational leaders and even from a lot of helping professionals. They say, well, I have such a rich lived experience, but no one at my workplace knows about it. And that of course could be their choice, but also sometimes they say that they feel that if they share that they have a lived experience, that it could disadvantage them from certain jobs or working with certain client groups. So I'm going to be talking a bit about lived experience and the kind of lived experience that I've seen quite recently in the helping professions, and also how our lived experience can be seen as a strength. And I'll be sharing a little bit about my story as well. And for those of you who weren't aware, my team and I recently released a survey which was looking at psychosocial hazards and psychological safety in helping professions. So this survey only recently closed in the last few days, and or depending on when you're listening to this episode, of course, but it was only released very early in April. And one of the questions I asked was, do you identify as having a lived experience in any of the following? And this isn't an exhaustive list. There's many lived experiences that may not be captured here. There was another option for other, and the options that were on my recent survey were mental health, family violence, disability, neurodivergence, homelessness or housing instability, substance or gambling use, refugee experience, adverse childhood experiences or ACEs, legal system, and other. So they were the options. I had just over 100 helping professionals, and these were throughout Australia. Over 90% of people identified in the survey that they had a lived experience. And a lot of people actually had more than one lived experience. The top three common lived experiences, according to my survey, were mental health, adverse childhood experiences, and family violence. And all of the lived experiences were identified in the survey as well, but they were the top three: family violence, adverse childhood experiences, and mental health. And it's really clear from these survey results that we're a helping professional workforce that is very much one of a lived experience, and that lived experience in helping professions is not the exception, it's the rule. Yet somehow we frame it, or maybe our sector frames lived experience as a risk or something that needs to be managed or mitigated. And it was really, I guess, reaffirming for me to actually see the number of helping professionals who felt comfortable to identify their lived experience. And we know it can be very difficult, can be a vulnerable position to actually acknowledge, yes, I have a lived experience, especially when it's a survey for a professional audience only. And I can't thank everyone enough who responded to the survey. It was remarkable to see just that many responses in a really short period of time as well. And so once I saw those survey results, it really had me reflecting on my own experiences. And so I was driving to Brisbane. And for those who don't know, I'm based on the Gold Coast, and I was driving up to Brisbane and thinking about my dad. So my dad lived in Brisbane for a very long time, and I used to visit him up there. And my dad moved to Australia and left school very early. I think it was year 8 from memory, or perhaps year 9, but my dad had a disrupted school experience. He left school very early. It was a different, different time, a different society. I noticed that I was one of my biggest motivators when I was, especially in primary school and upper high school in particular, I was very motivated by doing well academically. I kept pushing myself incredibly hard to try and achieve really good marks, to try and get into a really good university. And I put so much pressure on myself to accomplish all that I could, all that I was capable of in terms of my academic education. I'd been thinking more recently around what was my motivation for working so incredibly hard, often with unrealistic expectations on myself about what I could achieve academically, and whether I was intrinsically motivated to do it, or whether my own experiences in my childhood sort of shaped that desire to educate myself, to be able to go to university and get a good job and then have a certain salary, which would mean that everything wouldn't be so much of a struggle if I could have the university degree, the education, the good job. So I don't know whether I was intrinsically motivated to do really well academically and get into the university of my choice because that was something within me that was aligned to my values, or whether it was shaped by the environment that I grew up in, and some of my dad's challenges with school and his disrupted education. It's just something that I've been thinking about because I have conversations regularly with helping professionals that are in my network, or I supervise them or go to one of my trainings, and then we have a conversation. And so I hear lived experience discussed. It's like so often that I really wanted to actually open up this conversation. And what I've learned about lived experience, at least speaking from my own, what I know now, is that it hasn't actually held me back. It shaped the direction and the career pathway that I ended up choosing, which was social work. And my own lived experiences have really shaped my values and the value to really want to make a difference in my community. And I worked for a long time with children and young people in schools. So I worked with children and young people with mental health difficulties and also school disengagement. That was such a passion of mine for a very long time. And then now that I think about it, I wonder whether my own lived experience of having neither of my parents completing high school and going on to do further education, whether that drove me to help disengaged young people. There's something really rich about having a lived experience, and it can definitely be a strength when we reflect on it and we acknowledge that there are certain ethical considerations when we start to draw upon our lived experience. And ethical considerations, and these are some tips that help me, that hopefully will help you listening as well. But acknowledging our lived experience doesn't mean sharing everything. It doesn't mean oversharing. And some people could call it trauma dumping. We don't want to be trauma dumping on our colleagues or our clients. That would be the absolute worst thing to do. There's a saying that says that we should share from scars, not open wounds. So just add that little bit of lived experience, but then circle back and integrate that into what's going to be helpful for the client. The difference between presenting as, trauma dumping, dysregulated, and oversharing, that's too much. The level of detail is too great. And when you give a level of detail to a client about your situation, then that's when it becomes a bit of an ethical issue, and you are blurring the boundaries between, a friend and a client. But if you intentionally share just a small snippet with the sole purpose of it being helpful for the client, then you're remaining ethical. Think about, what's the purpose of you sharing this information? What's the purpose of you sharing your lived experience? And when we're talking about our lived experience, it's important that we're never actually venting. We're just intentionally and deliberately and consciously sharing just a snippet of information to benefit the client. Maybe it's to validate the client's experience, and let them know, hey, you're not alone in this. A lot of people struggle with this, and it's okay. Relate it straight away back to the client and what's going to be helpful for them. And when you have a lived experience, boundaries become essential. Like what we share versus what we don't share. So we need to be really clear. We have to also be careful not to over identify with the client situation and draw too many parallels between the client's own situation and our lived experience, particularly if there's a shared lived experience. And another consideration for helping professionals is, for example, if their lived experience is one of family violence, then they may identify within themselves that that's a field of practice that they're not comfortable working in because it's too closely aligned with their own lived experience. There's also a real strength in being able to acknowledge, well, I don't actually feel comfortable working in this particular setting because it actually is too closely aligned with my lived experience. I've had over 10 years of experience I've had in the helping professions industries, is that we as a collective of helping professions struggle with implementing boundaries. So it could be boundaries with clients around our time. We could be overgiving to our professional role, not taking breaks, not taking leave, and saying yes to absolutely every task. It leaves us overwhelmed and burnt out. So boundaries is a key part of this as well, particularly when we do have a lived experience. We need really clear boundaries in place that allow us to keep doing the amazing work we're doing with our clients, but actually have boundaries. So we don't overgive to everyone else and leave nothing left for ourselves. As this solo episode draws to a close, I would like to leave you with a few other things to think about. So when a lived experience has been part of your life, boundaries matter even more, not less, because it can feel more real, it can feel more personal, and sometimes our nervous systems can become activated if we're working with a client or a client group that has a similar lived experience to our own. And boundaries can be very helpful for us to really stay in our lane, be really clear on the scope of our role. So what can we support the clients with and what is outside of the scope of our role? And I don't know if any of you have seen the resource called the Involvement Continuum. And it goes from what does being over involved with a client and under involved look like. Sometimes we can slip into over identifying with the client and carrying a greater responsibility and overextend than what's actually within the scope of our role. So being very clear, and the Involvement Continuum is a great resource, and I'll share that in the show notes as well, because that's something that's really helpful to use. You can use it as a supervision reflection. You can use it when you're working with clients and feeling stuck. And actually, if you start wondering to yourself, have I started moving away from doing things with the client and trying to capacity build them to feel more empowered to look at possible solutions for their own situation? Or am I actually moving into the doing for? Am I actually going into rescuer mode and trying to rescue the client? And that's when we over identify with them and their experience. And without having boundaries, we can then start to move into overextending and over-identifying with our clients. And I just want to also reassure you, if you're thinking, oh, is it my lived experience? Is that why I struggle with boundaries, or is that why I'm over-identifying with the clients? And it's not because of your lived experience itself. It's because you don't have enough support or you don't have enough reflective space. Perhaps it's something that would be helpful for you to either journal about or engage in some regular supervision around, whether it's group supervision or individual, but actually starting to integrate reflective practice more heavily in your work, then it does make boundaries a lot easier, because you're giving yourself the time and space to reflect on your lived experience and how you can utilize that as a strength in your work as a helping professional. And for all the helping professionals out there who have a lived experience or multiple lived experiences, I want to assure you that you're not damaged, you're not broken, you're not an unethical practitioner. You're like a double threat. You've got the lived experience, you've got the learned experience. That's double the knowledge, double the experience. You can really harness your lived and your learned experience combined. You should consider those your superpower, because it's also what makes you unique. It makes you different to all of your colleagues, but different in a good way. Having a lived experience also means that you hold a lot of empathy for your clients as well. And without our lived experiences, we would be very different. We would have different values, maybe wouldn't be as passionate as we are about the different fields of practice we work in, and also make us amazing advocates for our clients. Recently, I was in a meeting with a lot of leaders from different sectors. There was a psychiatrist who'd said such powerful words, and he was talking about his own lived experience of being in a very low socioeconomic family, and the challenges of that, and the challenges of trying to get a further education when money was very scarce in his family. And he reflected on then his time working with patients, and he asked, I guess, that rhetorical question of the audience, I wondered, do we advocate so hard for our clients, for them, or are we actually fighting for ourselves? So when we advocate for changes in the system, whether it's a lack of NDIS funding or whether we're fighting for a client who's experiencing homelessness, are we fighting the system so hard for our client specifically, or are we actually fighting for ourselves and opportunities that we never had? Are we becoming the advocate for our clients that we always hoped we would have had in our lives? And I don't know many of you listening, but I just know that you're all amazing advocates for your clients, and that's because you're harnessing your double threat, your rich lived experience and your learned experience from your studies, from all your training, and that's what makes you so unique. And I want to leave you on that note. Thank you for joining me on Not Another PD. If this episode was helpful and you'd like to find out more, you'll find ways to work with me in the show notes. And if there's a topic you would like covered, or someone you think should be on the podcast, I'd love to hear from you. Remember, clear boundaries don't just protect our clients, they protect us